this node is sort of a bonus because during the masters of which this bridge forms a component, I developed a checklist for assessing gamification in data visualizations. So data visualizations are where you will get a set of data and present it in some very interesting visual way that is often a lot more comprehensible to people that are viewing it than just the raw numbers. So that ranges anywhere from sort of like graphs and pie charts and things, like very basic ones, all the way up to like interactive 3D manipulatable interactive software experiences where you can sort of zoom over different terrain types and adjust, how much rain there is and all that kind of thing. A lot of the visualizations that NASA puts out, sort of going to different planets and the distances between things and stuff like that, are a good example. Because all the information in there is accurate and factual. It's just presented in a way that the general public can understand a bit better. So part of the checklist that I developed was about assessing how gamified are these visualizations when they're presented as gamified visualizations. So gamification means adding game design elements to a visualization or to an experience that that are intended to make the audience feel as if they are having some kind of like progression or like some fun interaction with the system. And that's very vague, and there hadn't before been a explanation, or sorry, a way to measure gamification in visualizations. It was sort of one of those things where people would say, oh, we've gamified it by adding X element. You can move things around in the visualization, which is a good step. But there's a bit of a threshold at which it will move from just being an interactive visualization into an actual gamified visualization. And the difference there is important because when you gamify things, there's a lot of research that shows that it actually can help with knowledge retention and attracting audiences and allowing people to understand the system better that you're exploring. And that's the whole point of the bridge, is like, how do you use those things to then make games that can help people do retain the information and learn easier if they're a certain type of person. So what I'm going to do is the checklist is as a downloadable attachment in this node as usual, but I'll be going through each of the points and just talking about what that means and how that would actually relate to assessing your own board games. Because yes, this is for visualization, but as someone who is creating a science-based board game, you are in a way creating a visualization that's just very physical and very interactive. So visualizations can also be physical objects. So if you've ever seen a, I don't know, we've all seen where music is presented as a light show sort of thing. That can be done with data as well. And so, yes, so let's jump into gamified visualization and evaluating the efficacy of that. And I'll talk about how to map each of the points to make a checklist of both things that you can try and look out to see if your project is becoming enough of a game, or sorry, more of a game. And it's also a whole bunch of ideas about things you can include in your game if you're wanting to sort of increase the amount of interaction and options for the players. So first up is a visualization check. Let's not worry too much about that because we already know that we are trying to at least represent some information and, where possible, some actual data. And also the science-based game is based on a real-world concept, but this is not as relevant because this is specifically about real-world measurements, and we might not be using those in our game, and that's fine. So the next one are the 8 points of visualization complexity. So we'll skip to checkpoint 5 because, checkpoint 4. So immersing them beyond simple one method interactions. So this is actually something that can happen when you're starting out game design, you might have too few things for your players to do. Let's adjust the camera as well. There we go. You might have too few things for your players to do. So maybe they roll a dice and then they move and they're racing around a board and that's it. It's, you know, that is technically a game, but there's not as many elements of strategy to that, and the players might not know who they are or what they're doing or why, and they won't feel like they can impact the system or their chances of success because it's entirely based on chance. So I would recommend putting in, you know, maybe rolling to move, but maybe you roll 2 dice, and if you want, you can save one of those dice and roll it next turn if you like to get a massive boost, you know, something like that. Just some way that they can adjust their chances of success, or at least perceive to adjust their chances of success. The next point is, are there multiple inputs for interaction? So that means, can you manipulate cards, or will you just be using dice? Will you be sort of deploying cards or just taking cards and things like that? Usually the more of these things you can put in, the more it will feel like a game, but you don't want to go too overboard with that. Are there one or more goals for the user? So that includes the ultimate game goal. So with our virtual reef diver, the goal of that game was to get the most points by guessing the most creatures, but that was the overall goal. But the goal of each round, there are a few goals. So you were trying to pick the ones that you already knew the best or could guess the best. You're also trying to gather, what were they called? You're trying to gather certain cards that can help you survive into the next round without losing too many of your organisms you've collected. And there are also cards that allow you to interact with other players. So multiple inputs for interaction in this context means are there multiple ways for people to affect the game state and to take action on the game or each other. Are there multiple ways to achieve the goal? So yeah, sometimes there's only one way to achieve it, and that's okay, like in virtual reef diver. Also, this isn't like a tiered system where you can only do the higher things if you've done the previous things. You can absolutely have multiple ways to achieve a goal, but only a single method of input. So that would be it would be challenging, but you know, it could be done. And depending on the type of science you're emulating, that could be, you know, actually really important, and that could be the way that it is actually done. A lot of time-based games where you're sort of trying to achieve a goal at a specific time, not necessarily through strategy, is one example of doing that. So, yep, if you can add multiple ways, so maybe you can have an economic or a scientific or a military victory. You know, that's a good example of that. Simple multiplayer interactions, so you can add those to your game. Sometimes you won't have them in your game. So with Virtual Reef Diver, we added an element of being able to do votes. So sometimes you would get cards that allowed you to call, I'm going to do a vote, and then everyone could do that multiplayer experience. So you can add those kind of things. Is there complex user interaction with many different strategies available? So that sounds like an amalgamation of the previous points, and it sort of is. But complex interaction between users is things like, can they share resources, can they do a whole bunch of different things with or to each other rather than just interacting with the system? Is a visualization of a large or massive scale. So this might not be so much a point for making a board game, but I would say if you have anywhere from 8 to 30 players, that is considered a massive scale board game, because that's just huge. And we did do that for Sats and Stats, which you can see a playthrough of and an explanation of elsewhere in the bridge. But yeah, absolutely possible to do that, and the reasons why you would maybe want to do that, particularly if you're going into classroom settings. So those are the 8 points of complexity. We might as well call it for the purposes of this. And then the 5 keys of confirming gamification. So this is just a checklist of like, okay, like as a game, is it doing things that games tend to want to do? So like, does it look good? Because that definitely can affect whether or not people want to play your game. Readability, so can you understand what's being written and read? written and recorded if it's part of the game, if you're doing an app or something. Memorability, do they remember that they've played the game? Key game mechanics, are there things like tokens and boards and dice and turns and things like that? And centralization of data to concepts. So this is one thing that will be important to creating your own science games, is you have to make sure that the science is the core part of it. So one of the tricky things with sats and stats is that, yes, it's all about satellites, but the core of the gameplay wasn't necessarily swinging towards the scientific element of using satellites primarily as what you're doing, which is the key gameplay kind of goal there. It was swinging slightly more towards more of a sort of strategy conquest game. So it was more gamified necessarily than it was just an interactive science explanation. But that was fine because of the target audience was kids at schools, and so it was just good to get them in the idea that satellites can save you time and pick up information and reveal things that you wouldn't be able to see before using data. But yeah, that game could definitely swing back in the other way and go into more about the statistical methods applied to that data, just depending on the audience. So try and make sure that the science concept that you are using is as much as possible the core element of the game, depending on your audience, because it can be very easy to make a game about fish, but it ends up just trying to make a game about ecosystems of fish and becomes a game about real-time strategy fish wars against each other, and that's not really how it works. So, you know, again, just depending. Then there was a researcher called Wanaka, and he and his team went through about like what are the key elements of a game that let you know it's a game. So these are spectrums, you know. So fantasy and mystery. So are there fictional or invented information? This is where I slightly disagree with Veronica, because you can make games that are based on real life things, but you know, fictional and invented information can include information that just comes up out of the game itself. And I think that's what they meant. So if you make a game about, for example, the reef, you could use real temperature data instead of fake temperature data. Or you could use data that's generated by the players as they play, and then they use that and make decisions based on that information. So fantasy and mystery, I think it's, including elements in your game that aren't necessarily based on real life things. That can be a good thing that you can do to make it more gamified. Rules and goals. So does your game have rules and goals? I assume so. I hope so. Sensory stimuli. So this would be generally for data visualizations on computers, but it could also relate to when players are playing your game. Do they have a bunch of different stuff to touch, like game pieces and dice and cards, and can they move the boards and do those kind of things? And also, do they have interpersonal stimuli? Those are things you can add to make it more of a game. Challenge. This is the big thing, is there uncertainty about being able to achieve the goal? Games, I would say, are more fun and engaging if you don't know you're going to win the whole time. Like, there is a fail state. It's important to include a fail state. As much as I talked earlier about closing the loop and making sure that, actually I will raise the camera because you can see the sheet that I put up. In board games, generally one player will win, and that means all the other players lose. So that's not necessarily, you know, the game will end badly unless it's a cooperative game, but yeah, so there should be some sense of challenge, and maybe you are pretty sure you can win the overall game, but maybe you won't be able to do it as easily as you thought. That's an interesting thing to add in. And control. So can the users change or manipulate the visualization, the game, or aspects of it? So some people, when you make games, the players might not actually be able to affect very much in the game. So again, going back to that example that I said about, it's like a circular track, and the players just roll dice, and the result you get on the dice, you just move around the track. You're not actually doing anything there. You don't have any control. You're just rolling the dice and then moving where the game tells you to. Like, you can add in, to make your game more engaging, I would recommend adding in more elements where people can affect the system in a deeper way. And final parts are elements derived from Mullick's discussion. So I will link that discussion. So it was more, it was 10 points where a researcher by the name of Mullick was sort of going, well, for visualizations to be more gamified, they should include these things, or to count as gamified, they need to include these things. I would say you don't need all of these things, but they are good things to add. So you can add mental, social, physical, or memory skill requirements. So you need those things to achieve your goals. Maybe they have to remember where things are on the table, or they need to perform specific physical actions at a certain speed. Like maybe you're making a bee game and you're like trying to get the most flowers each round or whatever. Then we've got, does the visualization have hard fail states where the user cannot progress? So in board games, you don't need hard fail states because people are generally competing unless it's a one-player game. So don't worry too much about that one, but it is something you can add. You can say, well, if you run out of oxygen in a submarine game, well, then you die. In closing the gameplay loop discussion, note 8, sort of talk about why you might not want to do that in a board game, but who knows, maybe if you're intending on your game being played in a short amount of time, that's a good thing to have in there. You can make the game cooperative, where people can help each other out. It's a good way to make it more gamified. Interface clear and intuitive. Sorry, it's just my nose ring. It is important that players can understand the information that they're seeing on your cards, and that kind of information isn't hidden unless it's meant to be. You can make the game more competitive, where people are working against each other, add some trader mechanics, and also allow people to work secretly against each other. And then depth is the amount to which the types of interactions have multiple layers and multiple points of interaction between those layers, so that players can try different strategies. So if they hit a stone wall or someone's just doing way better than them at a certain thing, they can just reroute around. So the materials that I will have is the checklist, as well as the overall scale of gamification. Check that out and leave me some comments with any further questions. Thanks.